Let me introduce myself. I'm Connie Haas Zuber. I am both the host for today as the executive director of Arch and the lecturer, because I get to do one lecture every year, and this one's mine. This is the Arch Fun and Free Lecture Series, and today's topic is Himself When Young. It is my rendition with extra, it's kind of like the annotated version of this book, Myself When Young by Karl Detzer, who grew up in Fort Wayne 100 years ago and went on to become an accomplished professional writer. This is his memoir of being a boy in Fort Wayne. You will learn lots about it today. Oops, wrong key. Well, why isn't this working? Let me see. No? I should have, this has never done this to me before.
Of course.
Well, we'll just do what we can do. You can see that well enough, can't you? Let me make it a little bit bigger. It won't. Okay. Anyway, the lecture series is Arch's gift of education to the community because it's free and it's fun and you can come or not as you want to. I'm glad to see so many people want to. It is made possible by the volunteers who help it happen and who support the research going into it. I don't see some of the people who helped me, but I'm sure they're going to come. And also by the members and donors who support our operations and staff. This year's series is sponsored by the Lupke Foundation and Power Components Corporation. The whole theme of Arch is we invest in history for our future. You will see that theme on the handouts you have on your chairs. The purpose of this is to invite you to become an Arch member and donor to support this program and all that Arch and its historic preservation work contributes to community well-being in Fort Wayne and Northeast Indiana, because that's what historic preservation does. It contributes to community well-being. And we are also eager to hear your reviews of this program and your ideas for what Arch could be doing to make an even bigger impact. So let's talk. In person, by phone, in an email. There's contact information on the materials you've received. Feel free to use it. To get started on the actual content of today, I feel I need to confess that I am almost too happy to be presenting this lecture today. I will try very hard not to get distracted by the millions of other fascinating things that are in the book. You can see how festooned it is with sticky notes at places that I thought, this would be cool. And that I have learned while preparing the presentation. I have chosen some cream of the crop tales to share with you, tales that I can augment with additional historic research and images. Here's what we are going to cover today. We're going to cover the cast of characters, because you need to understand who the stories we're talking about. We're going to look at where Karl and his family lived during the time covered in the book. We're going to do stories. That's the fun part. And then we're also going to wrap up with a consideration of the period of Karl's life after the stories. So here we go with the cast of characters. The main character is Karl Detzer, who says that this book covers him ages 2 through 13. I will characterize him as a very smart child, maturing from young and impressionable enough to soak up everything said and happening around him like the proverbial sponge, to old enough to be out and about with his friends and getting up to some mischief. His father, August Detzer, a local druggist and prescription pharmacist of sufficient repute to be elected to leadership in the State Pharmaceutical Association, but who lost his store and their home after a failed attempt seeking county office. After some struggle, August became a successful traveling salesman. He was also a pianist and singer and had been a leading member of the local, very stylish, bicycle club as a bachelor. He might have been quite a catch as a husband. Karl's mother, Laura Goshorn Detzer, cultured and interested in current affairs and education. She was a close friend of Margaret Hamilton, one of the Hamilton sisters. She observed most of the social limitations that women of that time endured, but she kept herself sufficiently informed that she could cast a vote at any time should women finally get the vote. She was one of the owners of a local bookstore, which also sold art prints and sculptures and things, thanks to her. Grandfather Adam Detzer, August's father, and a strict, thundering Lutheran preacher who traveled a circuit of small churches using his annual railroad pass, which he had usually lost by February, but all of the region's conductors knew him and let him ride anyway. His otherwise cheerless demeanor was tempered by the gold loop earrings and the purple silk vest he wore, and the fact that he was cheerfully friends with the local Catholic bishop and Fort Wayne's Irish Catholic, respectable bar owner Jimmy Summers. He also loved baseball, though he knew he couldn't go on the Sabbath, at least here in Fort Wayne. Nobody knew what he was doing when he went to Chicago on a Sunday when his beloved Cubs were playing. And Grandfather Adam even attended the theater, not appearing to care at all about the scandal that was in these days when all the other ministers were thundering from the pulpit about the evils of theater. Grandfather William Goshorn, Laura's father, who lived with the family after his wife died. Because William was elected county surveyor before the city hired him away, everyone in town knew him and called him Bill. He was approachable to the children and took young Karl on many adventures. Sister Dorothy. The family also had 2 other children, but Dorothy is the one who gets more actual mention in the book. And finally, Uncle Gustav, August's brother, who was the esteemed head cashier at a local bank, as well as an esteemed and well-dressed man about town in his bachelor years. Gustav roomed with the family for quite a few years covered in this book. Karl was very proud of him and got to meet some very pretty touring actresses while accompanying Uncle Gustav around town. Uncle Gustav had to leave the very dank bank for his health and moved with his wife to California to a, quote, shabby but ambitious little village called Hollywood, where he bought presumably worthless land that now lies between Sunset and Hollywood Boulevards, not far from Vine, Karl says in the book. One can only hope he sold at the right time to the right people. Finally, you need to know that Karl Detzer's Myself When Young is one of my very favorite books ever, and you need to know why. First of all, he's a grand storyteller. Second of all, he's telling stories about people and a place, this place, that he loves. And it's a place I have come to love as well. He gets a lot of the basic history right, and I recognize that he grew up in the early and middle 20th century, with this book being published in 1968. So I will wince and move on through his very evident biases, mostly relating to the native people of this place, but also in his treatment of others variously disadvantaged by race or ability or poverty. He lived and wrote in a different time, a time I'm very glad we have moved beyond. Overriding my concerns, though, is my joy in how these stories do what history and historic preservation have the unique power to do. These stories reveal the magic in our ordinary places. People do better when they live in places that have meaning. Cities and businesses thrive when they have residents and employees who are connected to them. It's stories that connect us. Stories are the ways we come to understand what it means for us to be here now. So today, I am sharing my discovery of some grand stories in the hope they will add some magic and meaning to your connection to this place. They aren't the only stories, they're necessarily the best ever stories, but they are definitely stories with the power to connect. Karl, who was 77 the year this book was published, hadn't lived here for decades, but his pride and appreciation of his childhood here was bright and shiny as new. Here's how the book begins. For any boy with an appetite for legends, melodrama, and tales of danger, for heroic pioneers, frontier soldiers, spies, and savage red men, Fort Wayne, Indiana, at the turn of the century was an exciting place to live. Remembering my boyhood there, I pity those lads forced to discover a spectacular past only from printed pages, instead of from the lips of old men and women who had waited in the wings in the closing scenes of a gaudy drama. These tellers of adventurous tales had never shaken the firm hand of General Mad Anthony Wayne, who was George Washington's favorite frontier soldier, nor even met that fierce but peacemaking Miami chief, Little Turtle, the greatest Indian of them all. But their fathers or grandfathers had fought or traded with both of them and entertained both of them under their sod roofs, never at the same time, of course. Indians, Frenchmen, British, and finally the Americans had argued over that pinpoint of geography in what is now northeastern Indiana, which had to be held at whatever the cost to protect the upper Mississippi Valley and fur-rich wilderness to the west. Here, where the St. Mary's and St. Joe rivers joined to form the Muddy Maumee, the Americans had set up their strongest outpost. On a small rise of land where the rivers merged, only a step from the center of today's city, no, this is the beginning of the 20th century, had stood General Wayne's tall, stout palisades and log blockhouses that gave the settlements its name. Kikianga, the Miamis called it. The last traces of the forts had disappeared long before I burst onto the scene in 1891, but on the site of Wayne's blockhouses, the city maintained a small sodded triangle with a cannon mounted on a marble base to remind us of all we owed the general and his ragged troops. Every spring and summer, the ladies of the DAR planted fresh flowers around the marble slab, and if there were a ceremony, I made sure I attended. If I could escape with it, I carried under my arm my father's prized walking stick, a nondescript, overlong staff whittled from a log out of the last blockhouse. My grandfather Goshorn, an exacting man as behooved a surveyor and a civil engineer, after careful measurements and consultations of old records, set up his transit one day and placed the corner of the blockhouse on the short red brick walk leading down from our porch steps. His good friend, city engineer Frank Randall, disagreed with him. Mr. Randall, who thought that all important historical landmarks properly belonged on public domain, argued that the corner of the blockhouse had been somewhere near the middle of the street. Grandfather won. Okay, that's the end of what's in the book. But Grandfather Goshorn marked the spot on his front sidewalk right across the street outside that window. We are looking at the very spot, or we would be if the shades were down so we can see in here, though sadly, it is a parking lot now. That's where Karl lived as a little boy with his parents, August and Laura. Knowing this augments my appreciation of this block of East Berry Street, which frankly, otherwise could feel a little sorry for. It increases my willingness and determination to protect it and to educate people about its heritage. I hope it affects you the same way. I could not find a picture of the house the Detzers lived in, but I did find a streetscape from 1889, which gives a feel for the neighborhood. Karl enjoyed his young childhood here. It was the first house he remembered living in. He had been born on West Wayne Street. This is ridiculous. No, it'll catch up. And that house is still standing. I like this house. August and Laura had married in 1890 and moved there. So this is the perfect time to run through the family's other homes. Arch does not have a ghost story about this house for our haunted tour of West Central, but darn, it doesn't look like it should have one. Okay. The Detzers lost the East Berry Street home after August had mortgaged it and his drugstore business to finance his 1894 run for county treasurer, which he lost. This ushered in a time of job changes for August and moves to gradually improving rental homes. The first rental home was on the oldest part of Douglas Street, the part west of Calhoun Street to McClellan Street. This is it today. On one side is the oldest part of Lincoln National Life Insurance, and on the other side, it's the southern side of the Botanical Conservatory. Not at all like it was then. The neighbors, all gainfully employed working people, were very kind, and they may have been the most financially straitened people on the block, but his parents weren't happy there. And after not too long, they moved 2 blocks east to a much larger house owned by Laura's friend, Miss Margaret Hamilton, on Montgomery Street, which became Douglas Street east of Calhoun by city ordinance in 1929. That site is now the park area in front of the new part that Lincoln Life built. So that's not there either. The house here did not have a good yard, Karl remembers, but it had a great alley. Miss Hamilton suggested that Laura plan a new house for the family to be built on the Hamilton estate property nearby to the east, and they agreed on what the rent would be, all of $25 a month. That house was built on the southwest corner of Barr and Lewis Streets, near the building that was an art school, the ancestor of the Fort Wayne Art School, now the PFW Department of Fine Arts, after a long history entangled with the beginnings of the Fort Wayne Museum of Art. Now, that site is the Anthos Career Center, because suddenly the City Board of Education took the east half of the Hamilton block to make room for a new high school. This was Central High School, it became Anthos. But that new house was worth saving. They actually moved it 2.5 blocks west to the corner of Clinton and Holman, now Brackenridge Streets, near the Pennsylvania Rail Shops and the Gilman Lumber Yard. I am very familiar with that home site, and you may be too. It's just south of where you turn in to drop off mail in the downtown post office's 2 big mailboxes. The 1902 City Directory is the first to have the family living at 1319 South Clinton Street. So imagine that grassy site with a big house featuring a big living room, dining room, kitchen, butler's pantry, 6 bedrooms and bath, plus a wood-burning fireplace in the living room, which was an innovation in an era that favored gas logs. Here they stayed for a while Karl grew up. And these are the stories, and those are the stories we were really here for today. Actually, it was with his friends back here on East Berry Street that he earned his credentials as a mischief maker, though he insists not as a juvenile delinquent. That fine distinction, though, was possible mostly because local law enforcement was satisfied with the simpler concept of bad boys. Here's a story from the book. After one particularly amusing adventure, the awful details of which I am happy to forget, the Journal-Gazette referred to, quote, the work of the East Berry Street gang. My friends and I clipped out that item. It was a proud but rather frightening moment for all of us. What if a parent or two did a little startled guessing? Not many small boys lived on East Berry Street. Actually, we were not a gang. We were just the energetic sons of a druggist, a traveling salesman, a doctor of divinity, a bicycle repairman, a popular plumber, and a few other respectable citizens. We never fell into the clutches of the law. On the whole, the law must have been rather understanding of us, and we of it, for it was rumored among us that even policemen had been boys once. I hunted hard for that newspaper article, and I did not find it, and I consider that such a loss. And we'll stay on Berry Street for 2 more stories from the book. First, we will visit 128 East Berry Street. Today, it's the little parking lot next to a law office. But from the late 1890s into the early 1900s, it was the site of the building housing the Lehman bookstore under various detailed names, emphasizing the availability of engraving news and/or art, in addition to books, of which Laura was a part owner. Karl attributes her large book collection to being able to buy at cost from the shop. Here's a 1907 ad. The bookstore added more than just books to Laura's and the family's life. It added contacts with visiting authors and artists whose books and art were sold in the shop. Karl mentions Indiana artists, especially the Brown County painters Otto Stark and J. Otis Adams, who visited their home more than once with Mrs. Adams and their young sons. This was a time when Indiana was rich in famous artists in all media, including writers, one of whom spent considerable time in Fort Wayne and at the bookstore. I refer to Jean Stratton Porter, whose husband Charles was a pharmacist, leading August to refer to the famous author unfailingly as Charlie Porter's wife. From the book, my mother had never read any of Mrs. Porter's books, which made her out of step with the marketing world, if not the literary. It did not mar their friendship, however, and one summer day the two were sitting in the shade on the north side of our house on Barr and Lewis Streets. A double row of tall elms kept the morning sun off that yard, and my mother had an iron table and a few chairs there where she often served iced tea to all ages. "What's the name of your new book, Jean?" my mother asked. "Freckles," said Mrs. Porter. "Oh, yes, I tried to read it." "Don't try," said druggist Charlie Porter's wife. "You just couldn't like it, Laura. I didn't write it for you." "How many copies have you sold?" "500,000 so far," Mrs. Porter replied. "I sometimes think they just use them for paving blocks." The first author Karl ever met was James Whitcomb Riley, whose work he remembers he enjoyed. It turned into another adventure. His mother had 2 tickets to Riley's children's poet presentation at the Princess Rink, an ice and roller skating rink and the biggest auditorium in town, at Main and Griffith Streets, which we now know as the southeast corner of West Main and Fulton Streets. The rink was destroyed by fire in 1914. And she had his daycare lady, Mrs. Rupert, take him to the event. Their tickets were for the front row, center, right in front of where the poet was to sit on the low platform. After he was introduced, Riley walked on stage and read briefly from a book held dramatically in his left hand. Then he pulled a rocking chair to the front of the stage, but before he sat down, he reached out, patted Karl on the head, picked him up and sat down with Karl on his lap, to Karl's complete surprise. From the book. Pretending to talk only to me, he launched into, "Little Orphan Annie, come to our house to stay, to wash the cups and saucers up and brush the crumbs away." He was a stocky man with a big voice. He wore a gold watch chain across the front of his clean white vest, and a broad black cord fell from his rimless glasses, perched on a long red nose. His knees were knobby and hard to sit on, and he held me tight, probably to keep me from escaping. He smelled deliciously of something which long afterward I identified as a combination of good Kentucky bourbon and well-chewed cloves. His eyes looked pink to me, and I thought I saw in them proof of his love of children. I couldn't have been more wrong. He detested children, but it was years before I knew that astonishing fact. He wrote about children, but his interest in them was strictly commercial. I saw Mr. Riley once later in the street. He wore a long dark overcoat with deep pockets, and when he paused on the corner to talk to my parents, he lifted one elbow, indicated a pocket, and ordered, "Dig." I obeyed. So did all the other, quote, nasty little brats, as he called us in off-record conversations with his good friend, Dr. McCullough. The peanuts we found were unshelved, and there was always fresh popcorn. Riley's presentation that day was a big event. Fort Wayne Quest Club member Cheryl Colvin reported in a 1988 paper about Riley's 1898 visits here. Later that year in May, he recited at the Princess Rink in Fort Wayne before the largest crowd the city had seen since Thomas B. Reed had campaigned for the presidency. Advance ticket sales had reached 2,000. Before their arrival in the city, his manager received a telegram. Quote, "Please have Mr. Riley rehearse his turn suspended from the ceiling. There will be no room for him in the auditorium to rehearse." Seat sales largest but one in the history of the city. That one had been for a performance by Edwin Booth. Finishing our trip along Berry Street, we turn across the street from 128 to the Allen County Courthouse. And is Karl ever proud of that building? As we all should be. But he has family pride in it, thanks to Grandfather Goshorn's involvement in its construction. From Goshorn's long and fulsomely praising obituary in the Fort Wayne Sentinel, June 9, 1900, he had died that morning. Quote, "At the beginning of the work of building the new courthouse, Mr. Goshorn was appointed superintendent of public buildings, and his services in the early part of this undertaking were especially valuable." From Karl's book, and from a little boy's adoring perspective, a story about the cornerstone laying of November 17, 1897. The most beautiful structure in the world was the new Allen County Courthouse, for which he had been engineer in charge of construction. Not many boys had a grandfather whose name was engraved forever on a marble cornerstone, or for that matter, on the plates at each end of dozens of bridges. Editorial note. The courthouse cornerstone recently damaged by a vandal is limestone, and does not include Bill Goshorn's name. And I have checked a few bridges and not found his name there either, though I may not have looked at the right bridges. But that's really not important to the story, so let's go on. Nothing in my eyes could match my grandfather Goshorn's new courthouse. This was a Romanesque confection of white limestone from southern Indiana's Bedford Hills with beautiful Ionic friezes and gorgeous Doric columns crowned with Corinthian leaves. A heroic Statue of Liberty stood on its dome, which also boasted good readable clock dials a dozen feet wide. On the facade were busts of General Anthony Wayne, George Washington, Colonel John Allen, and Chief Little Turtle. The day its cornerstone was laid was the highlight of my young life until then. In the morning, there had been a grand parade with Governor James Mount in the reviewing stand, and I sat on my grandfather's big lap in one of Mr. Barnett's open hacks with the top down. Mr. Brentwood Tolan, the architect, and Congressman Jim Robinson rode with us, the latter talking a lot. And in front, Holding the reins on the driver's box was my friend and hero, Mr. Cy Fike, with a stovepipe hat and glowing nose. In the afternoon, right up in the front line where I could see everything, I watched all the maps, the day's newspapers, and other future heirlooms go into the copper box that was to be preserved forever in the cornerstone. At the end of the program, I did not sing America with the Other Children. They were not from my school, and besides, it was much more important to be holding the hand of the great man who was superintending the construction of the building than it was to sing. Here's a picture of that event. Karl and Grandfather Goshorn are there on that stage somewhere. It's not good enough resolution to dive in there and find them. I tried. That glorious day was then followed by an adventure another day when Karl and Grandfather Goshorn were alone at home and 2 county commissioners arrived for a serious conversation. Grandfather put on his boots and secured his revolver in his belt under his coat before telling Karl he needed to come too, since he couldn't stay home alone. A wagon was waiting to take them to the courthouse, then under construction. From the book. The architect and the paint job contractor were waiting outside the courthouse. With them and the county commissioners, we climbed a ladder into the unfinished building and up a rough stairway into the courtroom. There, in the middle of the floor, Grandfather, who had been silent all the way downtown, lighted a sulfur candle. It had a vile odor, and it would blacken the ceiling if the trim were not gold. And so it did, leaving a dirty, smeary black all over the phony gilt. We ran from the smell, but to my disappointment, there was no shooting. The contractor agreed to do the work over, and Grandfather went home and hung up his gun. One more Grandfather Goshorn story, because it's so good and so Karl. It's about rattlesnakes. Grandfather had a horse, which he kept at a farm at or near what we know today as Fox Island, then is now a flood-prone area. One very wet time, Grandfather got word from the farmer who cared for his horse that he needed to come out right away. Water was up all around the rise the barn was on, and rattlesnakes were gathering there, endangering the horse and the man. With his trusty pistol once again, and with Karl, he was off, this time using a rented rowboat to get to the barn. By the time they arrived, the horse had been killed by the rattlesnakes, but the man was okay. So Grandfather instructed Karl to stay in the boat and not put so much as a finger over the gunwale, and did I understand? Karl understood. Karl remembers that as Grandfather walked up to the barn, quote, he suddenly seemed to be enjoying himself. He fired his pistol, loaded, fired again. 11 rattlers died in one glorious half hour. Then Grandfather rode them back to the livery where he had rented the boat, and they went home after instructing the farmer to bury the horse. And they went home, where that evening, 2 lady guests of Karl's mother had questions about how on earth he could shoot snakes with a revolver. Don't they slither, was the question. From the book. They slither, Grandfather admitted. You aim carefully. You got to shoot him in the eye. After a moment of silence, Miss Margaret, her expression both admiring and incredulous, said, "Oh," and Grandfather went back to his newspaper. Stories like this, as well as Karl's worshipful respect of Anthony Wayne, policemen and firefighters, and his willingness to see the recent past as filled with heroic settlers, ragged but noble soldiers, and vicious, savage Indians, explains to me his side hustle of writing pulp fiction for the many magazines that published it in the early and mid-20th century. He wrote stories about soldiers, firemen, police, and cowboys. He had never lost those boyhood fascinations, many of which came to life in his Grandfather Goshorn, who, by the way, was a personal friend of Buffalo Bill Cody, whom he had met during some time spent out west. Karl got to meet Buffalo Bill the day he brought his show to Fort Wayne. Grandfather Goshorn took Karl downtown early before the show, and after the parade, but before the show, they saw Buffalo Bill on the street. "Bill! Bill!" the 2 men exclaimed as they greeted each other. Buffalo Bill then proceeded to complain about a woman he couldn't find, who turned out to be Annie Oakley, who showed up in a grumpy mood, so Karl got to meet her too, kind of. The whole family attended the show, and Sister Dorothy's favorite play character changed from Indian princesses and such to sharpshooting Annie Oakley for many weeks thereafter, he says. Grandfather Detzer spends his time in the spotlight in the book too, though for very different reasons. He never lived with the family, only stayed as a guest when he was in town between circuit visits to his churches. And he was a children should be seen and not heard type of grandfather who demanded that pet dogs be shut in the basement during meal times, leading Dorothy to sometimes leave the table and sit on the basement steps with the dogs in protest, without speaking, of course. But he had his moments, such as one St. Patrick's Day. From the book, I could not have been more than 5 years old the day I was really proud of the Reverend Adam. His friend Jimmy Summers, who kept the respectable saloon, as a professional Irishman, divided the year into St. Patrick's Day and 364 ordinary days. On March 17th that year, I had been allowed to go with grandfather to my uncle's drugstore. Note, August's brother Martin was also a druggist and had a shop on South Calhoun Street down toward Irishtown. So he'd been allowed to go with grandfather Adam to Uncle Martin's drugstore to see the parade. But after a few minutes, the old man left me and went next door for a friendly conversation with Mr. Summers. He did that often and always came back feeling much better. This morning, he did not come back, but no one missed him. Everybody lined the curb when the bands first sounded. Leading the procession came Gart Schober's men, all with green ribbons tied to their instruments, bravely struggling with the wearing of the green. Then the Hibernian rifles marched past in their splendid blue and white uniforms, with green rosettes pinned to their chests and green ribbons streaming from their guns. Behind the military companies came the plain and fancy Irish of our town in wavering ranks, row on happy row. And to my utter delight, there in the second row came my clergyman grandfather, purple vest and earring and all, arm in arm with Mr. Jimmy Summers. They were keeping step with each other after a fashion, but ignoring the band. Grandfather was holding aloft his ebony cane, which someone had decorated gaily for him with ribbons of green. He was waving it enthusiastically and shouting something about England being kaput. Both he and Mr. Summers seemed extremely happy. "Look at grandfather," I shouted proudly. Uncle Martin looked and went into a swift decline. When he recovered sufficiently, he telephoned my mother. That evening, my father and his brother solemnly put grandfather on a Wabash Railroad train for Defiance, Ohio, where they had family. And thereafter, they always shushed me when I mentioned the glorious day when grandfather marched in the parade. I was proud, too, the day of his funeral in 1903. 1,000 mourners jammed St. Paul's German Lutheran Church, a half block from our house. The bell began to toll at high noon and continued its mournful ritual until the last of the carriages disappeared, the horses clumping slowly far out on Madison Street, which starts at the doorway of the church and goes east, on the way to Concordia Cemetery at 4:15. There were 2 extra carriages of flowers. It was a good long service because 7 preachers participated, including 2 of grandfather Adam's minister sons. 6 of his 7 sons carried the casket to the grave. The congregation sang Ein Festeberg as they knew it should be sung, with stamina and conviction, and it was heard for blocks. Yes, it was heard distinctly away up there. We children had felt awe, but no warm sense of affection for the fierce old man. Perhaps it was pride that caught in our throats that overcast day when the bell tolled endlessly. At any rate, we all went home to our rooms, shut the doors, and had a good long cry. Otherwise, St. Paul's Lutheran had been a difficult time for Karl and, much more briefly, for his sister Dorothy. But her independent spirit freed both of them from the difficulty. The problem was that Karl's mother wanted him to attend that school so he could learn German. But it didn't teach German. It taught in German to children who already knew German. And it strictly punished all misbehavior, including children who couldn't understand what was expected of them. Corporal punishment. For some reason, Karl never thought to tell his parents what was going on. It was just how school was to him. He knew nothing else. Until the day, 2 years into his attendance there, that Dorothy and her twin Don began school there, from the book. School started. I was clean and brushed and had my high shoes on and was in my seat in Herr Professor Gerberding's room, behaving properly, when I heard a shrill scream from the first grade directly across the hall. Then another, and still another. They were cries of anguish, outrage, and horror. They were also in my little sister's voice. I heard a scuffle, a stern German command to sit down, answered by another shriek of defiant rage. Then Dorothy appeared in the corridor, running, her new books under her arm. Herr Professor Strider was rushing after her, but she was faster, and before he could really catch her, he had to turn. Brother Don had popped out of the door and was racing into the open air after Dorothy. I could not be the only member of the family left, so I packed up my books and walked slowly home. I found my father in a fury. Herr Professor Strider had hit Dorothy across the knuckles with a ruler, her first experience with corporal punishment. Had any teacher ever hit me? Of course, I said. They hit everybody, every day. My mother was speechless. She merely sat shaking her head and at long last demanded of me, "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because everybody gets licked in school," I repeated. My father said, "I'll go over and settle it." He neither pocketed a pistol nor tucked a blacksnake whip under his arm. He owned neither pistol nor whip. But he started out growling and walked fast. In half an hour he was back. To my disappointment, his clothes were unruffled. There had been no fight. My suffering was unavenged. "They are so stupid they don't understand what I was objecting to," he reported. "Starting this afternoon, you are going to the Clay School," which was the public school, very close to them. My mother did not argue. Languages finally had lost. She said she would take us. She knew Miss Lloyd, the principal. So with the three of us in tow, she started the 8 blocks to the Clay School before 1 o'clock. It was elegant. It was clean. And there wasn't a paddle in sight. I fell in love with my teacher, with the twins' teacher too. They were beautiful Miss Slaughterly and even more beautiful Miss Irma Doctorman. I never missed their kleine catechismus. I can't say it was Karl's dismal start at school that was decisive, but school does not appear to have been important to him. He read early and voraciously, and he became a professional writer, but he did it without academic credentials. His family life was a marvelous, wide-ranging education, with grandfather Goshorn to spark interest in science and technology, and considerable emphasis on literature, history, and the arts, plus exposure to artists of all kinds. His father, August, was a musician, a pianist, and a singer of considerable ability, for example, and August took young Karl to see important theatrical performances in town. And then there was Uncle Gustav, August's brother, who roomed with the family for many years before he married. Gustav shared Laura's love of Japanese prints, and he shared August's love of the theater. And Gustav knew theater people. From the book. "Even without a parade to excite us, we youngsters like to stroll up Calhoun Street." "We youngsters like to stroll up Calhoun Street at any day or evening hour with our handsome Uncle Gustav and his jaunty walking stick. Traveling salesmen in the staunch oak chairs on the sidewalk in front of the Aveline house didn't always glance up, but the young ladies who would rather get the binding on their skirts soiled all around the bottom than ever sit in the Aveline house chairs often looked 3 times. When they did, Uncle Gustav blushed slightly, lifted his hat politely, then quickly and properly turned his gaze straight ahead. Uncle Gustav not only was famous for the courtly way he tipped his hat, particularly to old ladies, but also for the elegance of the row of hats on the pegs in his closet, each ready for some special social, patriotic, or business occasion. In summer, he usually made do with a straw boater, with the colors of the St. Joe River Boat Club in its ribbon and bow, even though he didn't own a boat. Spring and fall, it was a fawn or pearl gray derby with a tightly curled brim that his adoring Miss McPhail, who knew all kinds of funny words, said was simply de rigueur. In winter and at funerals, the derby naturally was black. For special evenings of it, he had a gorgeous silk topper, and for scorching along on his bicycle, a tight linen cap with a long visor to keep dust and sun out of his eyes. On our Calhoun Street walks, we liked the pleasant way our uncle greeted his male friends, raising the walking stick in a sort of semi-military salute as if it were a saber. Chiefly, we adored his kindly habit of introducing us to interesting and very important people. How else would I ever have met our great reform mayor, Mr. Chauncey Oakley, or Mr. E.B. Kunkel, who owned one of the first, if not the first, horseless carriages in town? Mr. Kunkel ran a small machine shop, and he smelled pleasantly of hot engine oil and wore an impressive mustache, which I once heard my mother tell my father was obviously dyed. There was also a happy Sunday afternoon when Uncle Gustav and I were passing Mr. August Bruder's jewelry store, and he stopped to chat with the gorgeous Miss Nellie Van Valkenburg, the famous actress at home briefly from a triumph in New York City's brilliantly gaslit Herald Square. She was carrying roses when Uncle Gustav and I met her, and she gave me one. This naturally generated a flaming love affair, unilateral of course, that persisted until the enchanted evening when my good uncle introduced me to Miss Julia Taylor. There we go. This is Julia Taylor with George Lessee in a 1911 production of Romeo and Juliet. Fort Wayne's own Miss Taylor was playing a one-night stand at Mr. Frank Stouder's Temple Theater, which is on the site where Citizen Square is now. In Mr. Charles Major's Who's Your Masterpiece, Alice of Old Vincennes. Once again, who's your artists were everywhere. She explained in a fine musical voice that she had been very badly treated in New York by a terrible man named David Belasco and a pair of brothers named Froman. I immediately declared war on all Fromans and all Belascos, and looked forward to the day when I could go to New York and take it out in their blood. Uncle Gustav was a man who blushed easily, and I remember how he flushed crimson, at the same time looking immensely pleased, when the exquisite Miss Taylor, recognizing him 50 feet away in front of Mr. August Bruder's jewelry store, rushed up to him, flung herself into his arms, and kissed him. Everybody was watching, too. My mother explained that people did that sort of thing in New York City, and no one minded it. For years, I had a mental picture of the metropolis, and of Herald Square in particular, with beautiful actresses rushing up to handsome men like Uncle Gustav all over the place and kissing them, while no one paid the slightest attention. Miss Taylor not only was beautiful, affectionate, and kind, but she was the first young lady I ever saw wearing mascara. I liked it. Uncle Gustav certainly liked her too, I figured. Why else would he have a supper party for her in the Aveline house at 11 o'clock at night after the theater, where they ate Blue Point oysters and Welsh rabbit and drank champagne, just the way Grandpa Adam always hinted stage women did. There are so many more great stories in the book, but I want to conclude with a look at how Karl Detzer's story turned out. It began, as we've seen, with a glorious boyhood, full of adventures and experiences to learn from. It's the sort of start that you fondly hope doesn't fade into a boring or disappointing adulthood. It did not. The stories just kept coming. He left school at 16 and began work as a reporter photographer at the Journal-Gazette. One of his assignments was as a railroad reporter. He stayed there 9 years, selling the home at 910 West Wayne Street, where he was living with his parents, to his parents for $1. The red house in the middle is the house. So the years of unsuitable rental homes were far in the past for August and Laura. In 1902, they had invested in vacation property in Leland, Michigan, with other leading Fort Wayne families, including Harry Nind and Marshall Mahurin, and built a summer home there, triggering a move of several leading families there. And here's the story about Leland that tells the story of them being there, being the big investors, and all the people who followed them up there. Karl left Fort Wayne after he sold the house to his parents to join the U.S. Army, which sent him off to the Mexican border to fight against Pancho Villa. He became a sergeant there and was sent to officer training school. As a captain, and after the U.S. entered World War I, he was sent to France, where his battalion saw heavy fighting. He stayed in Europe after the war, assigned to the Department of Criminal Investigation, because things were a little out of control for a while. The local papers proudly reported on some of his arrests and then closely followed his court-martial for cruelty to prisoners. He was acquitted and left the Army, settling in Chicago, where he worked for newspapers and met and married his wife Clarice in 1921. They moved to Leland, and Karl decided to become a professional writer, which is how he spent the rest of his life. He published fiction in Saturday Evening Post, Liberty, and other publications, and worked for 4 years in Hollywood as a screenwriter, bringing some of his own stories to the silver screen. He and Clarice owned the Leland area newspaper for 4 years. In 1938, he began writing for Reader's Digest, becoming its first roving editor, a job he held until his retirement in 1977. As a writer, I can think of no more wonderful job than a roving editor for a major national publication. You can go anywhere, write about anything, and just follow your nose. That would be, oh my goodness. Anyway, he re-enlisted in World War II, earning the Distinguished Service Medal and rank of colonel, and served as a special advisor for the Berlin Airlift in 1948 and 49. In 1978, he returned to Fort Wayne to receive an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Indiana University, Purdue University in Fort Wayne. And I have this picture from the celebration of it. Anybody else recognize the people on the right and left? That's Karl in the middle. That's Ellie Golden and her husband, Dr. Edward Golden, on the other side. When I bought my copy of this book at Hyde Brothers, there was a note from Karl in it on his Reader's Digest stationery that included this picture. I knew Ellie from when I covered the Fort Wayne Museum of Art. She was an artist, and her husband was a doctor. So that is eminently cool. Karl and Clarice's son, Karl Jr., who for some reason was called Mike, died in 1958, possibly from complications of wounds he received in World War II. Clarice died in 1982. Karl died in 1987 in Connecticut, survived by his daughter Mary Jane, who lived in Connecticut, was probably why he was there. He was buried in Leland. His obituary has this quotation: "My America is the golden land where a 16-year-old boy could leave school, find a job in an hour, and never be out of work in 69 more years of war and peace. In a long life on 4 continents, I have had an opportunity to compare my country with the rest of the world." He had written more than 1,000 stories and 12 books. Questions, comments, things you know that I don't?
How did you find the book in the first place?
Because every time I go to Hyde Brothers, I look in the Fort Wayne history section.
Okay.
Well, I looked at it, thought, this sounds good, so I
Have
got
you
it.
ever heard of him before?
No,
Oh, you even worked at the paper.
pardon me?
You even worked at the newspaper.
Yeah, I've had this for a long time.
Huh.
And I'm not the only person who is madly in love with this book. There's another co-fan back there who sent me pictures and information. Yes.
I got it somewhere. I don't know if you moved, and I was looking on bookshelves and I thought, where did this come from? I don't know. I must have bought it somewhere. So I decided to read it a few months ago. It's just a marvelous book. I mean, it had me laughing. And it's highly recommend.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it will just appear on
Yeah, the
somebody
library
else's
has it.
bookshelf.
You can read it for free on the Internet Archive. It's been digitized there. Hyde Brothers usually has a copy of it. I have seen it on Amazon, though I think it will cost more there than Hyde Brothers. But it's really worth it. Like I said, these are the kinds of stories that really connect you to places. And for forever, I've been going, okay, where is that? I mean, I even looked up where Martin's drugstore was, where August's drugstores were, and I could have bored you with pictures of things that aren't there anymore for hours. I decided I'd be gentle on that because I wanted to tell some stories for people who hadn't heard them before. And obviously, there's the whole book of stories, and these are the ones that I really, really wanted to get out. And I did most of them. So,
Do you know any other books written from this time period around Fort Wayne? Our grandfather lived within blocks of this at the same age, and we don't know these stories.
well, with the picture of him and the Goldens, I wonder if Ed Golden somehow crossed paths with him, either in school or in the neighborhoods. Because Fort Wayne was tiny then, and everybody lived around here.
Yes, right. Yeah, right. This is not the people with the Golden's store on.
No. Yes.
Do you know how his other books did?
Well, they did well enough that one of them was turned into a movie, Car 99. So he supported himself and his wife and his children as a professional writer. So obviously well enough.
Did he have one publisher, or you know?
This is Funk and Wagnalls. It does not have a list of other books by in it, so I don't know who published his other books. With Reader's Digest being his employer, Reader's Digest may have published books also. I don't know how Reader's Digest handled that sort of thing. A lot of times when you work for a publication, they kind of control how your stuff is written. I'm sure most of the 1,000 stories, once he was working after 1938, appeared in the Reader's Digest.
Was it all nonfiction?
No, fiction.
Oh.
His memoir was different. And he credits Clarice with talking him into writing and being his goad and advisor and all of that. So Clarice was a journalist also. And when he went back into the Army for World War II, she ran the Leland newspaper in his absence. So,
Any idea what the population of Fort Wayne was around 1890?
30-some thousand. It was little.
About 50.
About 50, pardon me. I underestimated. Thank you, Craig. So it was not big. And this was a time when the newspapers reported on people going to visit other people and coming back home, so you knew everybody. Or there was a strata of people who knew everybody. And August and Laura were among those people. I'm really sorry my computer isn't interfacing with the things right. Weird things happen, I'll figure that out. Anyway, if you have more questions, I'm here. You are, once again, this is our gift. It's made possible because people support us. And you are indeed invited to become an Arch member and donor. If you want to do it today, we have membership forms over here on the table. You have instructions in your hand of how to do it online. It's very easy. I'm so glad you were here. I hope you enjoyed it. You have the schedule for the rest of the season. Hope to see you again. Thank you so much.